go. So, just to get started, I want to welcome you all and thank you for coming. Today we are having, we're talking about a very important topic, and I'm excited to have you all here. My name is Diane Silverman. I'm the executive director of the Quorum Initiative. And I think we all but have people in our lives and our existence that when they reach out to us about something, you listen. You know that, there's some people will send you links to things and you're like, okay, I'll get to it. When Marsha Henderson sends a link or reaches out, I listen, and I know I'm not alone in that. She is a woman of extraordinary insights. And when she sent me a link to an article by Cindy Suarez, I knew that this was important. The article was called The State of Black Women Leadership is in Danger, and it was in the nonprofit Quarterly magazine. And it talks about a study that was done by Dr. Lawson at the Washington Area Women's Foundation, and I'm just excited. I'm thrilled. A quick, just to tell you a little bit about these women. Dr. Tamara Lawson is the president and CEO of the Washington Area Women's Foundation, which is a community-supported foundation that invests in the power of women and girls of color in the Washington, D.C. area. Under her leadership, the foundation released the report that we'll be talking about today. The report's called Thrive as They Lead, Advancing the Infrastructure to Support Black Women Leaders in the D.C. metro area nonprofit sector. Dr. Lawson is also has been the Movement, Issue, and Charitable Organizations Director at Act Blue. She was the Director of African American Outreach for the Democratic National Committee during the 2000 election cycle, and amidst all of this, found time to get her PhD in American Studies. Busy, I know. Ms. Marsha Henderson is a Quorum Initiative member, the former Associate Commissioner for Women's Health at the FDA. During the time that she was there, she progressed and managed cutting-edge policy research and educational outreach initiatives. Her tenure produced the first FDA Women's Health Research Roadmap, and she's just a cutting-edge individual, and I'm just so grateful for everything that she does. If you have any questions, if you'll just put them into the chat function, and Ms. Henderson will get to them as appropriate. And I'll just ask that you mute yourselves when you're not speaking, just so that we can hear Dr. Lawson, and Marsha. So without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to them, and thank you.
Well, thank you, Diane. I really appreciate your choosing to accept my suggestion, because I will tell you, Dr. Lawson is truly remarkable. I had the opportunity to read this study. It was sent to me by a friend, and once I read it, I sent it all over the place. And one of the things I know about Quorum is they have a large membership, both in the US and overseas. And often their members, as I have met them, had the opportunity to meet them, are very high profile women that are often lawyers, partners, division directors, etc. So they're very busy. So they always record the session so that they can send it out to them, because often the way that they catch up with what Quorum is doing is by the recording. And I then watched a program that was put on by Dr. Lawson. Didn't have an opportunity to meet her until I saw her in action. And I was amazed. And I will tell you why. This report, which Diane has told you, titled Black Women Leadership in Danger, this study was released on November the 26th of 2023. And when I sent it all over the place, it was before sort of an avalanche occurred. And I refer to that by identifying a few things. One was Dr. Claudine Gay was forced to retire. Now, the report came out in November, but the former president of Harvard, first black woman, had to resign just a couple of months later in January the 2nd, 2024. Then someone sent me another report, and it was titled, "Dear Black Women, Your Job May Be Killing You. Leaving your toxic job could save your life." And that was January 30th of 2024. And then I got another article, and for those of you who may not know him, Byron Allen, who is one of our few Black billionaires, his area is owning communications networks. He owns, for example, the Weather Channel. He made remarks at an event where he said, first, they dismiss you. Then they discredit you. Then they demonize you. Then they destroy you. And Black women experience it the most. I was shocked. I wasn't ready for all of this. But then, of course, I reflected back on the genius of Dr. Tamara Wiles Lawson and said to myself, she hit the nose on the head. So I need to know more about her. And I thought maybe you did too. So, Dr. Lawson, please tell us a little bit more about you, about the foundation, and why you did this study that predates all of these things that occurred.
So thank you so much, Marsha. First, I want to say I'm delighted to be here. I am actually quite familiar with Quorum. When I was the director of the Washington, D.C. office of the Posse Foundation, I was introduced to Quorum and was in your ranks for a while before I left to work in the foundation arm of the Washington Nationals baseball team. And so I made that transition and kind of got caught up in that corporate world. And then the pandemic hit. So when our director of communications reached out and mentioned that she'd heard from Diane and asked me if I knew what it was, I said, oh, I absolutely know what it is, and benefited from the community that I was a part of for a short time while I was with the Posse Foundation. So really delighted to be with all of you, and excited that you're still doing the work and standing in the gap for women leaders. And since leaving the Washington Nationals philanthropic arm, I have taken on this role. I was familiar with the Women's Foundation because it's a storied institution that's been around for over 25 years in the region. I am 10 months in, so haven't even hit my year mark. And I know from the Quorum Initiative's work that you all know what I'm doing, right? I'm drinking from a fire hose, all of those analogies, trying to get my arms around everything. One of the things I am most excited about that I inherited is this project and this work. Within my first couple of weeks, the wonderful leader, Jackie Lindsay, who I succeeded, said, this group has been thinking about this work and has been advancing this research. And the thought is that the Women's Foundation should be the place where it is housed. And so right around the time I joined, KDF Strategies, the wonderful consultant group led by Kalisha Dessou Figures, was wrapping up interviews. And the idea was we were going to do something with the research, and a report made the most sense. So I got in seat just in time to be able to lend my experience and expertise and
All my clothes are in the laundry machine.
I hear a young person. My daughter's here. My daughter's at home today. Her spring break started yesterday. So whoever that was, I'm swimming in the same ocean. In any event, we made the determination with my support that the Women's Foundation was the logical host for this project. And let me provide a little bit of context. A small group of leaders who are all participants in something called Leadership Greater Washington. And that is a cohort group of leaders that exists across the country. There's a leadership, Atlanta, and a leadership Nashville, like they're all over the country. And so I'm also a member of Leadership Greater Washington. A small group of leaders from that organization were socializing together and talking about a disturbing trend. And it didn't feel like a one-off. It felt like there were multiple high-profile departures of leaders in this region in the year prior to the work on this project beginning. And these leaders said, instead of us just kind of having a social conversation about this, is there something that we are positioned to do, given our privilege and access? And the answer to that was yes. So they found KDF strategies and decided at minimum research would be the entry point. And so the project is a culmination of a year's worth of research and work. And so, as Marsha mentioned, it was released in the fall. And by the time it was released, the Women's Foundation's paws were all over it. And I am just exceedingly proud that within my first 9 months in this role, we were able to get this research out there. And Marsha, you mentioned the high profile national departures that happened after the report was released. But I think it's important for me to say to this group that the report is groundbreaking in that these women are saying the quiet part out loud.
Yes.
It's not groundbreaking because what they're sharing is new.
Yes. Yes.
Right? It's that they felt supported and empowered to share what many Black women leaders have been experiencing for decades. The nature of the interviews, they were anonymous, and KDF Strategies did a wonderful job creating a safe space for folks to just kind of lay bare how they're feeling about leading organizations in the nonprofit and philanthropic sector. And one of the reasons we believe the report has been so resonant is because folks are seeing themselves in the report. And to a person, and I'm not overstating this, the women I've spoken to have said, were you in the boardroom with me? Like, were you at the coffee shop when I was talking to, my sister leader friend who I use as a sounding board? Like, were you there when I was being interviewed? Like, how could these women possibly know my experience? And I'm an attorney and I work in Milwaukee, right? I'm not even in the philanthropic sector, but what was shared bravely by these women was so poignant because it is typical. And so I'm both proud of what we've been able to do to get this report out there. And I'm also devastated that it's so resonant. And that, in the weeks and months following the report, it just continues to be validated in ways that speak to a need to address what I have been calling a crisis.
Well, you've already raised a very important point, which is that it's become universal and decades long, because, as Maya Angelou once said, we wear the mask. And certainly her famous We Wear the Mask poem speaks to what happens, certainly in the workplace. So tell us what's behind the mask. What did you find?
So I will name the 10 themes in the report. You all have the opportunity, if you hadn't before us gathering here, to dig in a little deeper. I'll name them, and then I'm going to pull out, Marsha, if that's okay,
Yeah.
the 4 or 5 that have seemed to resonate the most with people. So the 10 themes were around leadership, support, expectations, vulnerability, resisting scarcity, boards, compensation, funding, donor relationships, and wellness. And just as a reminder, this was really rooted in the nonprofit sector here in the Washington, D.C. region. And what I want to pull out is that when we look at the recommendations that are at the end of the report, they are aligned in particular with 4 or 5 themes: leadership, support, boards, funding, wellness. And pulling out a couple of pieces from each of those, when folks talked about leadership in this context, what they were really focusing on was, what's the best way for me? Unrealistic expectations about deliverables for both new and existing leaders, right? And also this notion that I was introduced to this concept called, which some of you may have heard before, called pet to threat. Pet as in, you know, you bring in a shiny, wonderful new kitten that everybody is really, really excited about. And then find out that the kitten has claws and, you know, folks in the family spin out about what they're going to do. But the kitten is doing what you would expect a kitten to do, right? Or the shiny new penny. And the threat piece comes in when you've got these dynamic, wonderful, brilliant, nuanced, complex Black women leaders that everybody is super excited to hire. And then they get in and immediately their authority and their expertise is undermined. And so the leadership theme is about that. You get in seat and are there to do what you talked about in the interview process, but within days, in many cases we've heard, or, you know, within the first couple of weeks, certainly before the 90 days, the first 90 days are up, everybody on the board, or many people on the board, some folks on staff, are calling into question your decisions. So that was one of the reoccurring themes within the leadership piece. The other that I'll call out for the purpose of this discussion is boards, because I just referenced it a little bit. I don't know of a leader of any gender, race, ethnicity who hasn't had some challenging interactions with boards, right? I mean, I think that can almost be, that's like a universal thing that happens. What these leaders who we interviewed said felt particular to them was, again, connected to that pet to threat piece, but just this notion that they should be happy to be there. And that their selection was a privilege in and of itself, separate from, again, their expertise, the vision that they bring, and that because they should just be excited to be there, the level of autonomy and the level of respect that their women, and in many cases, white women predecessors experienced, they did not have the benefit of that, and that their boards at every turn would undermine them and or create an environment where it was really difficult for them to lead effectively. Another theme I'll pull out from the 10, and then I'll and I'm going to skip through funding and support. Funding in particular is just about for a bit of context, how much more difficult it often is for Black women leaders in philanthropy and in the nonprofit sector to access resources that their white peers can do more easily. But I want to skip to wellness and talk about something that you referenced, Marsha, which is the cumulative impact of just 2 or 3 of the things that I've already mentioned over time, and how physically and mentally exhausted and unwell, almost to a person, the leaders who were interviewed said was a real challenge for them. We had multiple leaders talk about being incapacitated by stress-related health challenges. We had folks talking about the need to access resources, mental health resources that they could barely afford, and the need to be able to push back a bit, but because of the environment of scarcity in which they are operating as nonprofit leaders, that is difficult to do. So the recommendations that are in the report that, perhaps, Marsha, we can talk about a little bit later, are directly connected to the themes that I pulled out. I'm proud of the fact that after the report was finished, we kept the momentum of the work going. We collectively made the decision that the report was not going to be the end, but we wanted it to be the beginning. And so we did a series of focus groups with the initial participants in the project, where we really did like a visioning session. Like, if you had any resources, if Oprah called and said, I'm going to drop $500 million and you can have and do whatever you want, and any Black women leaders in the country want, what would that look like? And we kind of opened up the space. We opened up the space and encouraged them to come up with bold ideas for what they wanted. And I don't know about you all, I often find that difficult. I qualify like every 30 seconds. Well, and I ask a whole bunch of questions. Well, do you mean, like, is it unrestricted funding? Is it funding, right? So we encouraged them to just dream. And the recommendations that they came up with are what we have our eye towards as we look at how we can build a better infrastructure for Black women and Black gender expansive leaders. But I'll pause there because I've been talking a lot.
Well, as I read this, and then, certainly others have had their experience, and knew that this session was going to be held today, I put it on my LinkedIn. And I introduced it by saying something like, excellence is apparently not enough. Because, see, the way that we get into a leadership position in the first place is to be outstanding. Right. I don't really know of mediocre, very marginal Black women who get the opportunity to learn on the job. Right. And I've never been, I have to, full disclosure, I've never been responsible for being the CEO of a nonprofit. I was a national board chair of an organization, but I've never been in that kind of leadership position. I was in government. But so many of the things that were in this report still resonated with me. And I remember the way that I figured out how to get promoted, because I came into government right out of graduate school, and I was really at the bottom, which is exactly where I should have been. Okay, let me just say, I did not know a thing. But what I learned quickly was to learn my job well. And then it became, I was the troubleshooter. That's what they called me. They gave me the worst jobs, right? Clean up, go fix this, right? So the assumption was I could do magic. And it was already understood that others had not done well in the position. That's how I got the position, right? Others didn't do well. There's a problem there. And what I learned to do was say, well, promote me. I'm okay where I am. I'm doing well where I am. But to go to the next level, I had to learn to negotiate. But what I didn't really know to negotiate was to figure out what was wrong before I got there and maybe get some of those resources or assistance. And so I was in the middle of, the middle of the ocean, by myself trying to figure it out. I'm sure others have had, kind of similar experiences. And when you mention boards, having been the chair of a national board, and I had to have a very hard conversation with the CEO because he wasn't raising money. And he actually told me, I have a big endowment. I don't have to raise money. Well, I'd never heard of a nonprofit CEO that didn't raise money. And he talked to me like I should be happy because he supported my being the chair of the board. Well, I know what boards are supposed to do, and they hold the CEO accountable, not in a hostile way, but in terms of standards. And, it was as if I was saying something very alien. But something that you also mentioned, with resources, we're also in an environment where, you know, the question of leadership to some degree was reframed with DEI, right? And now, after George Floyd, all of these companies um, issued statements and all of this, and they were going to do all this, and so DEI was a big deal, and there were DEI officers, etc. Well, now all of my friends that took those jobs are now losing those jobs, and a prominent law firm partner told me at dinner, literally last night, that we don't do DEI anymore. We do mentors. So that said to me, it's no longer structural, right? What they're going to do, if anything, is not going to be structural to help the whole infrastructure. It's going to be maybe one-on-one with people that they pick. That kind of bothers me as well. But can you speak to some of those things that were mentioned to you, um, about some examples maybe of
Sure.
some leadership expectations that didn't?
Sure. So I think to set the stage for why I think the report was so timely, you mentioned George Floyd and the so-called racial reckoning that happened after that, after his murder. One thing that I think was implied that you didn't mention is the pandemic, right? So we had the confluence of a global pandemic, a so-called national racial reckoning, in which in the corporate sector, like healthcare across the board, and in the nonprofit sector, there was this call for ensuring that our leadership look more like our communities, right? And there were many organizations that stepped out and said, I think now is the time for us to do a better job with our recruitment, and we're going to find a Black woman to take the helm at the worst possible time, right? That is also not a new phenomenon. Folks of color, women in general, and then when you layer on top of that, folks of color often get brought in to do what you said, Marsha, to clean up the messes, right? To do a lot with a little. And so we heard a lot from the women that were interviewed about just ridiculously impossible expectations and a level of impatience to accomplish goals that were set out at the beginning of their tenure. I will say that, you know, there were lots of folks who talked about, again, this excitement about their arrival without the board doing any of the pre-work to help set them up for success. And that contrasted with what they knew was done for their predecessors who did not look like them. Right? So funders for their predecessors, funders in some cases were lined up, right? There was that first 90 days, there was an intentional effort for the board for their predecessors to introduce them to the community, right? To hold their hand through that really critical beginning stage of their tenure. And that's just one example of things that didn't happen for many of them. And then even after that first 90 days, fundraising, the nonprofit sector, like a lot of sectors, but nonprofit, it has its own special brand of relationship cultivation. And you gotta open doors for folks, right? And at least stick your big toe in to help people get entry. And so a lot of leaders talked about that dynamic. Leaders talked about the shambles of an organization that they inherited operationally. And either there was less than optimal transparency before they started. And that's a phenomenon that I think everybody on this Zoom has experienced at some level. Like, that's not singular to Black women, but the extent to which they were expected to clean it up with little or no resources, right? So that moves us into, you know, what was the financial health of the organization when they got in seat, right? And if the expectations don't change for leadership, but the infrastructure is in shambles, but you're being held to the same standards as your predecessors, how incredibly demoralizing it is to be held to that standard, be criticized, have raises and bonuses withheld without a recognition of what you were brought into. And so those are just some specific examples, but I want to say that there is, and I've heard a little bit about it, and it's I'm just going to name for you all that one of my concerns as we continue to talk about this report and move towards solutions is, I think in our human nature, when we hear about a community being harmed, right, is to want to place ourselves somehow or do a comparison, right? What I will say to this group is women experience leadership across sectors in a very different way than men do. because of the patriarchal structures in which all of our institutions exist and because of sexism. I am fearful and hopeful, but I'll start with the fear that both women of color and white women who encounter this report will see some common themes and say, well, this same thing happened to me, right? Like this isn't singular to Black women. What I will say in the safe space of this group, because I know who I'm talking to, is there is a very particular vitriol, a very particular undercurrent of disrespect, a very particular set of assumptions that Black women leaders have to navigate. And it is not a personal indictment on any particular community when you hear Black women talk about their experiences, right? So to put a finer point on it, anti-Black racism is baked in to the very fabric of this country in ways that it's really hard for people to separate. But if a Black woman leader tells you that she is having a particular experience, before leaning into whataboutism, pause and believe her. If it is across the board as difficult as it is for women writ large to lead and to lead effectively, right, because of the barriers that are in our path, when Black women name the kind of things that were named in this report, take a deep breath, right, and acknowledge that they're having this experience and believe them. So I said to the small group of Black leader, the small group of, actually, it's actually not Black women, not just Black women leaders, the seed group that I talked about earlier, who I'm still working with. And there's a man, I want to mention that. We do have a man in that small group of leaders. But I named that fear, that the whataboutism would get in the way of people really hearing this. There is a particular experience that we have. And I also don't want whataboutism, and here comes the hopeful piece, to get in the way of the ally work that's so critical. It is important that there were 3 or 4 out of the 8 or 9 leaders that seeded this work, that 4 of them are white, right? That's critical, that they were among the group that said, this is an issue, this is a crisis, and it's not their crisis, it's our crisis. But at its core, listening to and believing is really important. And Marsha, I'm going to say this jokingly, although it isn't a joke. You mentioned not having met a Black woman leader who isn't operating at a really high level. How great would it be? I don't know when this could happen, but when there could actually be, we could have as many mediocre women leaders
yes, absolutely,
as we do men. I have worked with
that's the standard. Actually, that should be the standard, because if you really want to be equal, right, you should have it all the way across the board, right? Well, I'm noticing. Go on. I don't want to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
I'm noticing a note that says, for Black female leaders, the challenge is not accomplishing the impossible. That the challenge comes in taking credit for it. And that's a very interesting comment.
Oh, that's a great comment.
Because something that I think about, and maybe this is not part of it, because I've met a number of women, particularly African American women, who were trained through their religious foundation to be humble, right? That's literally part of their Christian, typically, values, to be humble. And I've told this quick story before, but I got rid of that. I got rid of humility in the workplace. Had to, because it wasn't benefiting me. And it was a man that came to my door when I applied for 2 positions. One was a little lower than the other, but they had the same amount of money. They were both, one was a deputy division director, and one was a branch chief. And he came to my door and said, "Which one of these do you want?" And I did that, Black woman thing. "Oh, I would be happy with either position," because it was a promotion. And he said, with disgust, "You need to figure it out, and you need to strut." And, we work hard. All of us, we work hard. We come prepared. We are trained. When we are in positions to lead, what do people expect of leaders? They're not looking for humility. They're looking for direction. They're looking for instruction. They're looking for support. And so that whole taking credit, something I have observed, particularly with white males, is they take credit whether they deserve it or not. And I had a young woman that presented so well in her early 20s, and I was amazed at how fabulous she was. And I said to her, "How did you learn to do that?" She said, "Every time I approach a podium, I say to myself, find your inner white man." And that's what I do. That's what she said. "I find my inner white man." I have found men who are not qualified at all for anything, and they immediately say, "I should have that job," right? "I should have that job." As opposed to women who typically say, "Well, I don't have every single solitary thing on
Right.
the list, so I shouldn't even
Right.
apply."
I've got to
Right?
be overqualified in order for me to apply for something.
You
That's
know,
the
but
mentality.
I
Yeah.
have learned, because of the bad experiences of going with few resources or support, I really can learn on the job, right?
Yeah. Well, and
I
so many
can.
leaders do, Marcia. Some of the
That's
best
what we
leaders do.
do.
Yeah,
Every
that's yeah,
every
yeah,
leadership position is
yeah.
different from the last, every last one. Even if you do have a skill set that you can adapt to the situation, so that you have got to, in real time, one of the things coupled with taking credit in real time, right, is also letting people know in real time. You've got to let people know, rather than when there's a problem, "Oh, but this is what I really did for you." No, no, that's what politicians do that are successful, actually. They take credit all along the way. They don't wait till it's time for the election. The really good ones start telling you in advance, so it's already baked in, and that they're knowledgeable. And so it's very important to make sure that you do that. I think it's good to take some more questions, because these are all seasoned women that I'm seeing in these boxes.
I just want to add one point
Mhm.
to what you're saying, and I see the time and definitely want folks to be able to ask more questions. I want to complicate what happens though when you show up with authority. Some of those assumptions that I mentioned earlier is the perception as a Black woman leader, and this came out in the report, that you're right, you hire me for the very thing you hire me for, because I am self-assured and because I am able to articulate a vision and I'm dynamic, and then you're threatened, you then become threatened by that, right? And my self-assuredness all of a sudden looks like anger, or I get described as aggressive.
Oh, yes.
And so it's figuring out how to get support for addressing that, because that is we are finding a universal experience, that the perceptions are not equitable and can be really damaging and contribute to burnout.
One of the things I always advise some of the women that I mentor is to figure out where the real power lies. Be it where the real power lies and what do they want? Because there's certain things you may want to achieve, and all that's great. But what does the power structure really want? Because you often have to deliver that first to set the foundation for support. So if they want you to cross the street in a red dress, you're going to have to cross the street in a red dress. Okay. Now, then after that, there are a number of things that you can get done that are on your playlist, right? But you need to find out. I often would say the commissioner of FDA, where I used to work, was not in charge. Really, the division directors were in charge. So if you wanted something to happen related to drugs, you had to cozy up to the director of the Center for Drugs, right? Because that was real. And you figure it out. And sometimes you can't do it, right? It may be, I cannot walk across the street in a red dress. And then you need to leave sooner than later. One of the other things that happens is sometimes we stay too long in an environment that is a no-win.
Oh, we could have a whole conversation about that.
Oh, yes.
We could have a whole, we could have
And
a
then
whole,
we get beaten up, right? In
Yeah.
the process, we get
Yeah.
beaten up. And so it's being strategic about your environment and what leverage you may have in the moment and what you don't have that you got to build. Because sometimes you can't go in like blockbusters, you know? Although they say you can, that may not be real. You may have to take it a little more incrementally. And, that's the reality of being strategic.
I'm looking at some of the questions. I think without having seen it, I hit on one of the questions that you asked, Michelle, and thank you for that. This last one that came up from Julie Livingston, I think is important, which is how can non-Black women support Black women better? I think I gave one example earlier, which is to create opportunities to listen, like actually ask how folk, particularly if you're on a board, and or you are co-leading an organization or a part of a senior team, ask how they're doing and what you can do to support them, and then believe them when they tell you. I think, and that's an interpersonal recommendation. I think another, from a positional authority standpoint, if you are serving on the board of an organization that has a Black woman leader, hold yourself accountable, hold your peers on that board accountable for creating a healthy working environment between the board and the leader. I think what you do as a non-Black woman leader in any sector, when your Black women leader peers are outside of the room, matters, right? Are you standing in the gap for them and advocating for them when they deserve it, when they would benefit from your support, which may not be always as comfortable as you would like it to be? Are you willing to step out? Are you willing to pound the table for them when you know that they're not being treated equitably? If there are emerging Black women in your organization, have you reached out to them? Have you looked out for them? Have you held the organization accountable for ensuring that their elevation through the ranks of the organization is truly as accessible as it is for everyone else? If you see any of the themes emerging in this report, what are the ways that you can use your privilege and positional authority to introduce a bit of ease for emerging leaders that are coming up behind you, or your peers, and the conversations that you have at brunch with your friends. You know, if your peer group is like mine, I often take for granted how fantastic they are. They're running things all over the place. I've known them since college, so I forget about that. But when I really sit back and take stock, the conversations that I'm having with them in my downtime matter. So what are you talking to your friends about? And how are you all holding each other accountable for showing up as champions of, the fantastic and talented Black women who are in your organizations? And here's another interpersonal piece as a leader. What does your critical feedback look like? Right? As Marsha said, we're all learning on the job. If there is someone that reports to you, or there is someone that you are working with, does the feedback that you give them look like the feedback you give emerging white men leaders or white women leaders? Is there a way in which bias seeps in and you are holding them to a different standard? And what biases do you bring in the door with you when you're interviewing folks, when you are in a board meeting? What are some of the assumptions that you're making? There is a high level of self-reflection on an interpersonal level that I think is key. And then there is there's an institutional and a systemic, there are opportunities in both of those spaces for us to look at how are we shifting the culture of, in the case of this report, of the nonprofit sector in such a way that the lack and the scarcity that's mentioned isn't as destructive as it has been to Black women. Because whatever is, and this is across the board, and I feel like many people will receive it as an overstatement, but it's not. Whatever challenges are being experienced in this country writ large, Black women will experience those challenges disproportionately, whether that is in the boardroom, whether that is in ER waiting room, whether that is in a college admissions conference, whatever it is, because of our country's awful history with racism, and specifically anti-Black racism layered on top of patriarchy and sexism, we find ourselves at the intersection of a lot of unfortunate and damaging and harmful behavior. And so we are, as a foundation, the Women's Foundation, with this group and with this project, looking to disrupt that harm as it relates to Black women leaders in the nonprofit sector. A couple of ways we want to do that is by creating spaces for people to get some of the knowledge that you talked about, Marsha. The leaders who were interviewed talked about, particularly the emerging leaders, talked about wanting more opportunities like the Quorum Initiative, where they can learn from peers, where they can, almost like a boot camp of sorts for EDs and CEOs. And so we're looking at that. We kind of view that and other convenings like this as lower hanging fruit. The bold ideas that we have are along the lines of direct grant support for Black women leaders, so that they can do things like have a sabbatical that is separate from a sabbatical that their organization would provide for them. We are talking about creating more healing spaces. I've made this joke recently that, white men go on retreats all the time, but they're just called,
Golf.
annual golf and annual meetings, right? I want to bring that level of
Yes.
luxury And that level of indulgence to spaces where Black women can just sit down and be pampered and released and reflect on the kind of women and leaders that they want to be and heal. And all of that requires resources, and it is not subsidized in the way that those golf trips are. So it has to be discussed in a different way, but is equally, if not more, deserved.
Well, I love ending with a sense of wellness and healing. That's been my entire career. And it's true for all of us as women, particularly women of color. Um, and, as I think about this conversation, it's collective. That's one of the gifts that women have. We're very good at gathering each other in a circle and forming support. And that's something that I always do myself, try to remember to do, and model what behaviors I may witness that I think might be improved, which is something else. You learn by doing, but you also learn by observation. So when you have the opportunity to support another woman, it's always beneficial. And then you can come back and say to her, "Did you see me today with so and so, or in such and such a situation?" And um, was there anything there that you might think of for yourself? And I try to do that at all times. But I've thoroughly, enjoyed this conversation, and I know that it's probably time to turn it back over to Meg and Diane. But I have been honored to be on this conversation today with all of you, as well as the fabulous Dr. Tamara Wiles Lawson.
Thank you so much, Marsha. And just really one quick thing that I didn't say that we can all do for emerging and longstanding Black women leaders. I have had a white woman angel who has submitted my name for awards, and people think that doesn't matter. It does matter. So I talked mostly about internal things. That is an external thing you can do. If there is a wonderful Black woman professional in your organization and you have an opportunity to put her up for something, throw her name in the hat, do that. It makes a difference.
Thank you for that. It's huge. It can be career changing.
Yeah, that's incredible. Marsha and Tamara, first of all, it's great to see you. So it's wonderful to have you back. And Marsha, thank you both so much for what is such an important conversation. And I feel bad because we're cutting it off now and the conversation feels like we've barely even started to scratch the surface. So the one thing that I want to do is invite the opportunity that maybe we revisit this subject together again or regularly, and we figure out some way that we can do that effectively. And I don't know, Tamara, I'm thinking if there's anything Quorum can do to support the work that you're doing as a follow-on to the research, we would be delighted to do that as a community. I think I can speak on behalf of all members that we would be delighted to do that. So keep us in mind and we'll stay connected as well in terms of how we can help and how we can support. I want to call out how much I really appreciated being asked to listen better. Because it is true, the human nature is that you tie yourself immediately to whatever the person is saying, and then you say, "Oh, I feel that way too," or "I had that experience too." I really appreciated the call out, Tamara, to step back and truly listen, and then instead of commiserating, to actually ask the question about how you could support or help the individual differently. So that was one of the biggest takeaways. I wrote down 5 or 6 of the things, and since we're at time, I'm not going to list them here, but I will share my notes with everybody in case they were things, and invite everybody on the call to do the same. Share what you heard that you think was important, because I think this group has a lot of power to effectuate change, and it starts with each one of us taking a step to do that, really taking action. So I invite us all to consider that the first step that Tamara talked about, which was creating the opportunity, really listening, creating those opportunities to listen, ask how someone is doing, and then figure out how you can support them better and differently. I think that's just so important. So anyway, thank you, Marsha, for bringing this concept to us, and it's so important. And Tamara, thanks for your time, because I know everyone is so busy, and you in particular, you have a lot on your plate. So we're so appreciative. Quick shout out to mention that we are doing a retreat, and we would invite everyone to come, and it's actually in where I'm hang my hat these days, up in Narrowsbrook, New York, at the Blue Fox Motel. And that is May 17th through the 19th. And it's the women that already have signed up are just amazing. It'll be a fantastic time to connect, think about some of these kinds of issues, share, take care of ourselves, all those kinds of good things. So anyway, I invite you all to join us if you can make that work. We would love to have you. And Diane, did I forget anything really important before I thank everybody for taking time out of their busy schedules to be with us today?
Nope, that's it. And send your comments. I'm going to share them out as well as the recording of this session. And to reiterate what Meg said, Dr. Lawson, we really look forward to working with you and appreciate you educating us and the work that you're doing. And we really want to work with you. So, and Marsha, thank you.
Thank you, Marsha. Thank you, Diane.
So big hugs to everybody. So great to see everyone on the call, and let's see if we can't move forward with thinking about how we do a better job of supporting Black women leaders. I think that's the commitment we need to make today. So there you go. Thank you, Marsha. Thank you, Tamara.
Right.
Be well, everyone.